Good day, everyone. I am Attorney Joseph Noel Estrada, and the title of this lecture is The State of Philippine Education and the Role of Law in the Transition. So in this 1-hour lecture, I'll try to present the helpful data on education for us to see where we are now and the state of Philippine education immediately prior to the pandemic. And I would also like to discuss some well-entrenched principle in education law and to show that we have enough policies and principles to support continuity of education, and that also we have enough policies to help us through our journey in this new normal brought about by the pandemic and also the disruptive technology and education. Let me start by saying that education is perhaps the most important function of the state, and that this function is realized through the schools, through the educational institutions, whether they are public, government, or private, or religious schools. And that the cost of delivering education to more than 30 million Filipino learners and students is high, that admittedly even the state cannot afford in its entirety. That's why it needs the complementarity between the public and the private sectors in the delivery of education. This discussion is extant in the deliberations on our Constitution, 1987 Constitution, by the framers, the one who placed these provisions in the Constitution. And accessible quality education, therefore, is a shared responsibility among the students, the parents, the government, and the private education sector. And again, the state recognizes the complementary roles of the public and the private sector in the delivery of education. This is provided by the Constitution, no less. That's why, again, as I've said earlier, we have enough constitutional basis, we have enough laws that support continuity in education, and that there is no basis, there is no cogent reason for our state at this point to implement an academic freeze. Otherwise, our leaders would be committing dereliction of duty and dereliction of their mandate as provided in the Constitution. So, should we really have to let this academic year go, no, as proposed by many sectors? Again, as I've said, we have enough policies, constitutional basis to support continuity in education. I'd like to refer to you two important provisions in the Constitution under Article 14. First is Section 1 of Article 14, which provides that the state shall protect and promote the right of all citizens to quality and accessible education at all levels. Please take note, and shall take appropriate steps to make such education accessible to all. This is the mandate of the Constitution. All right? And Article 14 speaks about the compulsoriness of basic education, particularly elementary education, and that the state should be able to establish and maintain a system of free public education, all right, in basic education. And as specifically mentioned in Section 2, I'm referring to this article, Article 14, that elementary education is compulsory. When we say compulsory, then all students of school age should be sent to school by their parents. In fact, under Republic Act 10533 or the K-12 law, not only elementary education is compulsory and mandatory, but all levels in basic education. And the Supreme Court affirmed that this is legal, that there is no transgression from the constitutional provision which only says elementary education is compulsory. Because according to the Supreme Court, the Constitution did not prohibit the expansion of this compulsoriness principle. And so, what I wanted to say is that the mandate of our law is that education is compulsory. And so, therefore, our regulators, our implementors, should be consistent to what the Constitution provides. All right? That there should be a way to deliver education. And right now, we are not completely incapable of delivering education to our learners. As a matter of fact, we have the technology, we have the different platforms, we have modular modes, no? Not necessarily those that require gadgets and technologies. So education should be delivered. There should always be a way to deliver education consistent with the mandate of the Constitution. Now, when we think of ways on how to deliver education, all right, we should relate this now, especially for school administrators, we should be able to relate our authority to find ways and means to deliver education with the mandate of the law to provide reasonable regulation and supervision of all educational institutions. All right? Because when we speak of reasonable regulation, all right, the framers of the Constitution explained it in this wise, that when the Constitution speaks of state supervision and regulation, it does not mean in any way mean control, but only a reference to the power of the state to provide regulations to ensure that these are duly implemented. It does not include the right to manage, dictate, overrule, prohibit, or dominate. Therefore, there is enough room for educational institutions to innovate and be creative and find ways to deliver education. And the mandate of the state is merely to implement reasonable supervision and regulation and not control. All right? And moreover, in recognition of the complementary roles played by the public and the private educational institutions, which of course is validated by the constitutional provision I earlier cited, again, the state must exercise reasonable supervision and regulation over education institutions. And very clearly, the framers of the Constitution again explained that when the Constitution gives state supervisory power, it is understood, please take note, that what it enjoys is supportive power. That is the power of oversight. Please take note, no? Ano po ito? Before the issuance of the 1987 Constitution, ito na po ang discussion, no? That reasonable regulation is not control, no? That's a key takeaway. And more importantly, and we find relevance today, that reasonable supervision and regulation is the supportive power of the state, no? Supportive power of the state. So that's why in many discussions and forums, I always reiterate this appeal to our government to implement a less regulatory environment in education, especially at this time, and that regulation should be in that sense, which is supportive of educational institutions, not control, all right, or restriction, but more on giving support, especially now that we need education to thrive under our present circumstances. Okay, now moving further, here's another takeaway from the constitutional deliberation on reasonable regulation. When the Constitution speaks of state supervision and regulation, it refers to the external governance of educational institutions, particularly the private education institutions, as distinguished from internal governance by their respective boards of directors or trustees and their administrative officials. Again, with this principle, I think and I believe that the educational institutions have enough elbow room and latitude to be able to innovate and find ways to deliver education, because external governance by the state, through the Commission on Higher Education, through the Department of Education, refer only to the external governance, and that the internal governance is lodged with the respective boards and administrators of these educational institutions, both public and private. For state universities and colleges, they have their own boards of regents, and they have their own charters. So they also have enough room to have their academic judgment and discretion. All right. The state recognizes also the indispensable role of the private sector, and in fact encourages private enterprise and provides incentives to needed investments. I'm citing this because, again, I'd like to emphasize the role of the private sector in the delivery of education, and especially now during this time of the pandemic, that again, all the more that we have to show that the delivery of education is a shared responsibility and that we need complementarity for it to work. All right, so in effect, we have the public education sector and the private education sector, which are the two main drivers in one Philippine education system. All right, so again, we have two drivers, the public and the private, and both are important sectors which contribute to the attainment of the national development goals. And the public sector receives 100% government funding to operate its schools, while the private education institutions have to be self-sufficient. It is tuition funded by the parents and the students, and they have to ensure that they generate enough funds to deliver quality programs. So the two sectors operate on a different policy environment, and while reasonable supervision and regulation is exercised and essentially exercised in the private education sector, in the public sector, it is more of control, particularly in basic education. All right, what the state exercises over public schools is one of control. All right, because again, funding justifies control. Government funds 100% the operation of the government schools, and so therefore it also has the power to control the direction and the operations of these government or public education institutions. Now, I'd like to show to you here in this slide, particularly for basic education, the share in enrollment of the public and the private sector. The blue bars are representing the public sector. You see the disparity, particularly in the lower grades. We have very high participation rate in the public sector, very low in the private sector, but significantly in senior high, the participation of private sector is also very high, but only in senior high school. All right. All right. The total enrollment in basic education from last year's numbers, the participation rate of the private sector is around 15%, around 2 million of the 27 million total learners in basic education. So 85% of enrollment in basic education is in the public schools. All right. But again, for senior high school, the data, the enrollment share for private school is high. Almost equal, around 45% of the enrollment share are in the private sector. In college or in higher education, there are more students enrolled in the private colleges and universities than in the state universities and colleges. But it's almost equal. It's around 56% enrollment in higher education are in the private colleges and universities, and the remainder is with the state universities and colleges and the state colleges and universities. But let's look how the public and the private schools compare in terms of operations, in terms of effectivity or efficiency in the delivery of education. All right. So here it shows the overall the private sector performs better in terms of outcomes with the students. There are significant differences, for example, in basic education on specific subject areas. And again, it shows that the private sector performed better. All right, I'll just go through these slides. These are the areas: mathematics, science, basically the areas where we scored very low as a country in the PISA. All right, now here are the key findings from those data that I have shown you. First is that 17 out of 17 regions, the private schools have higher scores in the achievement tests of the students, and in the regions, 9 out of 17 perform better in Filipino, 9 out of 17 in Araling Panlipunan, 13 out of 17 regions, the private school students perform better in math. In science, it's 13 out of 17. English, 16 out of 17. The private schools have the most number of significant math, science, English subject areas where they perform better. Now, overall, there are 13 out of 17 regions where the private schools have better national achievement test performance. Now, in terms of salaries of teachers, this is also how it looks like. The teachers in the public school sector, of course, they receive higher because their salaries are legislated. It is guaranteed. It is appropriated by our Congress. While in the private sector, the salaries of teachers is subject to the regionalization, the regional wage rates, and of course the ability of the private school to pay the salaries of its teachers also depend on the budget that it generates from enrollment and from the capability of the students to pay. Here, as shown in this table, the increases in salaries of the teachers from 1989 to 2019. The increase has been significant in the public sector. And here is the average monthly salary difference in basic education between the public and private sectors. Unfortunately, in those regions highlighted, the difference is very high. For example, in NCR, 34%, in CARS 43%. There are some regions like Region 12, Soc-Sargent, 124% difference in their salaries. In BARM, 158%. All right. For the entire country, All the regions combined, 71% difference in terms of salaries of teachers. All right. This is the difference of average monthly basic wage of primary school and secondary school teachers by sector. This is in 2018. All right. You see the difference, and the disparity is really very wide. All right, now let's go back to the effectiveness and efficiency, as I've mentioned earlier. All right. Well, first of all, as a country, I think we need, based on the studies also by the ADB, we need to increase our spending for education in terms of GDP. Our government spending is only 3.3% of our GDP compared to other countries, our other peers, which is at 5% or more. And that research and development expenditure is also very low at just 0.14% of our GDP. I think the United Nations standard is 6% of the GDP of the country. So right now, compared to our ASEAN neighbors, we are at the bottom. All right. In 2017, we only spent 3.5% of our GDP. It's very far from the target 6% of a country's GDP based on international standards. Here also it shows the varying markets and constituents that the public and the private sectors cater to. Those who can afford, of course, go to the private sector, and those belong to the poorest, and the poorest actually go to the public education institutions. But the problem is the crowding out of the poorest in some public higher education institutions, because those who can afford still opt to go to some state universities and colleges. The University of the Philippines, as an example, where many of the students there can actually afford to pay in private colleges and universities, but opt to study in the University of the Philippines, and in effect they crowd out those who should be there in terms of being poor, and in terms of needing access to government educational institutions. Now, here's for the junior high school programs. All right, this would also show the cost effectiveness of the private education institution. I'll go to the takeaway. Some of the slides here are very hard to explain and would take time, but it shows from the tables and the data that the rates of return of graduates of public and private in the higher education sector are similar in the average, but for the private sector, it is lower in cost. In other words, the government spends more money in sending students in its government schools than the private sector spends per student in the private education institutions. But the rates of return are similar, almost similar, in terms of outcomes of the students in the higher education sector. And for basic education, as you may know, again, as I've shown earlier, the rates of return are better in the students in the private education sector. On average, private education appears to be more cost-effective than the public education institutions. While on average, the higher education economic rates of return appear to be statistically similar for private HEIs and SUCs, the cost of state university inputs to educate a student is on average higher than of the private HEIs, as I mentioned earlier. the cost to private schools of educating their students is lower on average than that of the public schools. The empirical evidence indicates that private schools are more efficient than the public schools in this respect. All right. But there is, in the Philippines, we have this declining share of private education in terms of enrollment because of the free or near free education laws. Laws that provide for free education in higher education. We have Republic Act 10931, or the Universal Access to Quality Tertiary Education, passed in 2017, which provides for free education in state universities and colleges. And so therefore the enrollment in college favors the government schools in terms of access. But nevertheless, we have not seen a drastic decline so far. The numbers in private higher education institution enrollment remain higher than the enrollment in the state universities and colleges. All right, now there is this fear of crowding out the private education institutions, and there are consequences. All right, the bumping off of the private education sector, and so thereby eliminating that complementarity which the Constitution has envisioned. All right, the shares of private education enrollment at the basic and higher levels have been declining over time, even prior to the pandemic. This decline, again, is due to the free tuition or near free public education. And the crowding out of private education is induced by expansion of public schools, colleges, classrooms, and better paid public school teachers. As I've shown earlier, there is migration of not only of teachers to the public school system, but also of students as well. And this decline is likely to continue, especially now because of the economic reverses brought about by the pandemic, and students and families would be compelled to go to free educational institutions in the government. And this decline means that the national education system on the whole would become less efficient because, again, of the more efficient delivery of education in the private sector, and because now more students will be going to the public school system, we can expect that with this trend, there will be less efficient delivery of education in our Philippine education as a whole. Unless, of course, we do something about it through legislation and through the enactment of needed laws to preserve complementarity. Now, let's go to the pandemic hit. Because of the pandemic, many private schools have closed, and that there is massive migration of the students in the private sector to the public schools. Here, as shown in this news article, 865 schools, private schools, have suspended operations this year because of their inability, because of low enrollment. The enrollment so far has only reached 2 million, from 4 million, from 4.3 million last year in basic education. The enrollment in the private sector was down to only 2 million, so only 50% of the enrollment from last year. Not only that, 400,000 students or learners in basic education moved to the public schools, almost 400, as shown in this slide. So what do we do moving forward? All right, the problem on disruptive technology in education has been there even prior to the pandemic. Disruptive education meaning veering away from the traditional delivery of education. We have technology, we have online resources, and this is a challenge for the traditional or formal learning of students. And schools have been challenged by this disruption, this disruptive technology in education. Again, even prior to pandemic, but now even more so, we are challenged. We are threatened with our existence because of technology. And so, what do we do? First, I think we need to focus on the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics courses for students. More, the students should be encouraged to take STEM courses, because again, if we are envisioning 21st century learning, if we are envisioning the advent of technology and science, then we need more students, more professionals, more graduates to go into these courses, so that we have a chance to help rebuilding and reestablishing our economy, and to propel national growth and development. But here, as shown here in this data, the enrollment in the entire higher education sector in STEM programs is quite low. All right, the enrollment is only around 1.4 million for all education institutions combined, state universities, local colleges, other government schools, and the private sector. They only account to combined enrollment of 1.4 million for courses under STEM, and including agriculture. That's enrollment, and in the top 5 disciplines, actually, hindi po kasama lahat ng STEM courses here. So the STEM courses remain unsubscribed, and the graduates naman, it's also very low. The graduates of STEM courses or STEAM courses, including agriculture, accounts to only around 300,000 graduates from enrollment of 1.4. Again, this is very low, and I think the way to go is for our higher education sector to accept and encourage more students to enroll and pursue professions and courses within the STEM, within the field of science, technology, agriculture, engineering, and mathematics. Now, we need to revisit certain education principles that would really help us in traversing this new normal in education. One of which is this principle of in loco parentis. Whether in basic education and higher education institutions, we have to revisit the concept of in loco parentis, or this is a legal maxim in Latin, which literally means in place of the parents. This principle actually provides that the teachers, school administrators, and the school itself are regarded by law as special parents over their students, while the students are under supervision, instruction, and custody of the school. This is both a source of liability and a source of a right for the school authorities. And please take note that now, when we say under supervision, custody, and instruction, this may be simultaneously being exercised by the parents at home over their children, and the school over the students. While they are physically at home, the school exercises supervision and instruction over them through remote delivery modes, including online classes. But the policy does not change. School officials, school administrators, and teachers remain as special parents over these students, and so therefore they have the authority, they have the shared right to exercise parental authority over these students. And the duty of the parents under the law, under the Education Act, is to coordinate and cooperate with the schools in making sure that the curricular and co-curricular programs are implemented and are enforced on their children even when they are already outside of the school premises and beyond school hours. Okay, now this pandemic also under and the delivery of education under the new normal emphasizes the role and obligation of educational institutions to maintain a safe and secure learning environment, and most especially now that security and safety no longer confine itself to physical spaces, and so therefore the school should step up in its efforts to provide or maintain a safe and secure learning environments for students. And this extends to cyberspace, to social media, and to the internet in general. So when we talk about safety and security, we now have a different and an expanded view of the learning spaces for students, which include, again, the cyberspace. We should maintain a cyber safe and secure learning environment for students, not only when they attend classes, but also when they interact with their peers and when they communicate with their teachers and other members of the academe. We should, as educators, ensure that they are safe from cyber crimes, no? And other offenses like cyberbullying, harassment, and sexting, and other inappropriate conduct. And of course, another law that is relevant on this respect, on the obligation of the schools to maintain a safe and secure learning environment, is Republic Act 11313, or the Safe Spaces Act, most especially because it deals with online gender-based sexual harassment, and that especially because in the school setting, under the law, under the Safe Spaces Act, there is sexual harassment even among peers, and even and may even be committed by inferiors over their superiors, no? As you may know, prior to the enactment of Republic Act 11313, sexual harassment may only be committed when the offender has authority, influence, and moral ascendancy over the victim. But now, under Republic Act 11313, pwede pong makakommit ng sexual harassment even those who are subordinate, no, to their victims. No? So, ibig sabihin po, most specifically under Section 16 of the law, it says that students may actually commit sexual harassment against their teachers and students among their peers. Coaches may be victims of sexual harassment committed by their athletes or trainees. So, and this is important because sexual harassment and gender-based harassment may be committed in cyberspace. And remember, this Do Better movement that started, I think, June 14 or June 24. And the school should be able to handle this better so that it doesn't spill to the internet and Twitter for students complaining because, again, of lack of access to grievance procedures and administrative procedures that safeguard the rights of students to be protected from forms of abuses, including online and online gender-based sexual harassment. So for our school administrators and teachers, please read on your own time the Republic Act 11313 or the Safe Spaces Law, so that you can prevent sexual harassment and other forms of abuses to happen in your school, to prevent being victims, and most especially to avoid being harassers yourselves. So again, Republic Act 11313. Another important piece of legislation that should be that should be taken seriously by our educators and the members of the academe is the Data Privacy Act of 2012, no? Because most especially now, because a lot of the dealings and the processing of personal information of students and even staff and teachers are online, no? Through online means. And as you may know, it's very easy to transfer information through online means. So that's why the school should be more vigilant as personal information controllers in protecting the privacy of personal information of the students. I would like to invite our educators also to read the recently issued National Privacy Commission Bulletin number 16, which provides for the do's and don'ts, privacy do's and don'ts of online learning for basic education and college students. And many of the reminders here may be helpful not only to the students but to the parents and guardians and even the school administrators and teachers as well. So I'd like to encourage everyone to read that again, the National Privacy Commission Bulletin number 16 on the privacy do's and don'ts. But let me share with you this key takeaway. You may have the all the means, technical and physical safeguards to protect breach of or violation of privacy of personal information of students, but the key really is focusing on people and behaviors and not only on technology. You have to train your people. You have to accept that privacy breach is an issue now in educational institutions, and that as school administrators and leaders, we should be able to immerse ourselves in the culture of privacy of personal information. Otherwise, all of this technology would be meaningless. And also, I'd like to share this view of mine that aside from putting in place processes and systems in our schools to protect the privacy of information of students, we should also make sure that the students are protected from their own unguided mistakes and misconduct in social media and cyberspace that also are likely to cause privacy violations on them without them knowing it, or with them regretting it later on. Because again, as I always say, the biggest threat to one's personal privacy is his or her own mistakes, privacy mistakes or misconduct. Now, as shown in this slide, no one is really immune from this. If you are not aware of your environment in the digital platforms, you are prone to privacy intrusions that may be made possible by yourself, by your own mistakes or through your own mistakes. Say, for example, this news that came out, I think just a couple of weeks ago, where a legal analyst at CNN in the US was seen masturbating during a conference call with colleagues about the presidential election, and this was captured in national TV. Imagine this. And also in Brazil, where the businessman was seen naked on Zoom and kissing his partner's breast during a video conference, thinking that the camera was already turned off. And huwag na po kayong lalayo, merong kapitan dito sa Cavite, hindi po ba, na nakuhanan din sa Zoom performing lewd acts against another barangay official. So again, these are things that we should remember, not only when we talk about systems and protection in the schools, but also when we talk about students and guiding them and putting in place the discipline policies so that they are also protected in cyberspace and social media against privacy intrusions that again may be made possible through their own mistakes. Okay? And this is a takeaway in terms of in the discussion on data privacy. Let me emphasize that humans are the weakest link in any organization, as provided in this article. An organization may have implemented the best data loss prevention software, but all it takes is just one disgruntled employee to ruin all the good work done to demonstrate compliance, di ba? Totoo naman ito, no? So, with untrained staff and personnel, all of this highly sophisticated data protection, anti-hacking system, all of these things would be meaningless with a very weak, no, human factor, no? So again, we need to train people to embrace the importance of data privacy. Hindi ba? Parang marami kang policies, marami kang systems in place, pero pag yung faculty during their own time magkukwentuhan about their students, about personal information of students, baliwala lahat ng mga systems na yan, no? Because again, humans are the weakest link in any organization. Now, in our discussion in this topic, no, whether it's data privacy, not only in data privacy but on all matters that we have discussed, particularly those that involve challenges brought about by the pandemic, let me just tell everyone that there is no perfect solution to any problem, and there are only perfect storms. And for the new normal in education to work, it requires change in the mindsets more than upgrades in technology. We often have this misconception that we need more technology for education to thrive during the pandemic. But again, more than that, I think we have to have change in our mindsets and for us to be able to adapt to the new normal. Okay? Here are some of the proposals that we have from the Coordinating Council of Private Education Institutions to deal with the matters that I've raised in this lecture. First is we continue to push for legislation on complementarity, a strong piece of legislation that promotes and encourages complementarity in the Philippine education system, where both public and the private sector are able to thrive and coexist and share in the responsibility in the delivery of education, and provide policies that make students and parents focus on learning outcomes and not on the type of provider. Because I think the student's choice is compelled by more on access. Because it is free, they go to government schools. Even if they want to go to the private schools, they do not have the means. I hope a time will come that the students would be given that choice, that power of choice of their schools, and because they are given the means by the government. So it may take the form of a voucher where they can use, which they can use in any school, whether public or private. And create a targeted portable education subsidy, all right, that targets the students who are deserving and who are in need, all right, and that and also to improve the quality of school choice by creating a labor market and human capital development observatory, incentivize education as a social and economic driver by creating programs for human capital development, particularly enacting the Teacher Salary Act, which I have been pushing for at least 2 Congresses now. Hopefully a legislator picks this up. A Teacher Salary Protection Act, which protects the teachers in the private sector also against the unintended consequences of increasing the salaries in the public school system, and a lifelong education and training facility for faculty, all right, and upskilling of professions similar to what they do and have in Singapore, in Malaysia. These are, I think this would require another set of webinar to explain all of this. But I'd like to say that finally, there is no perfect system in education to counter the challenges that we face. But COVID-19 will not wait for us until we are ready, until the schools are ready. And learning must not only continue during this pandemic, but quality education must also thrive. With that, I'd like to say thank you to everyone, and I hope you find the discussions in this lecture helpful, especially when you go back to your roles and functions in your respective schools. Magandang araw pong muli sa inyo lahat, at maraming salamat.